Morning arrives long before the light does. Frost clings to strands of wire stretched across a landscape that has forgotten the difference between horizon and boundary, while the first sounds are neither voices nor machines, but the quiet scrape of boots upon frozen earth and the distant creak of timber contracting in the cold. Somewhere beyond the fences, fields continue toward villages that cannot be seen, and roads carry people who will never know the names of those gathered here. Inside the perimeter, however, the day begins according to another clock, one measured not by freedom or intention, but by whistles, orders, and habits repeated so often that they have become as predictable as sunrise itself. A figure rises slowly from a wooden bunk whose rough boards have remembered countless restless nights. A blanket, thin from years of use, folds back with practiced care before being shaken free of dust that settles into pale shafts of morning light filtering through cracked boards. Around him, dozens of others perform almost identical movements without speaking, each aware that unnecessary words consume warmth as surely as unnecessary motion. The room carries the mingled scent of damp wool, worn leather, coal smoke, and human endurance. Every object has acquired the polished surface that only constant handling can create, every nail and beam quietly bearing witness to seasons that have passed without permission being asked of those who lived beneath them. You watch the room awaken without urgency. No one rushes because there is nowhere to arrive early, and no one lingers because time inside these fences belongs to someone else. Outside, a guard tower gradually emerges from the mist, its outlines softened by frost until it seems less like architecture than another feature of the landscape. Yet unlike the trees beyond the perimeter, the tower exists solely to remind those below that observation never truly sleeps. Even silence is shared with unseen eyes. There was never a single kind of prisoner of war camp. Across Europe, North Africa, and Asia, camps differed in purpose, nationality, climate, resources, and brutality. Some held officers whose days revolved around waiting and paperwork, while others confined enlisted men whose survival depended upon exhausting labor. Certain camps became known for discipline and rigid adherence to international conventions, while others drifted far beyond those protections, shaped instead by ideology, desperation, or simple neglect. Yet beneath those differences lay a common condition that united millions of captured soldiers across the 20th century. Every camp, regardless of its location, asked the same quiet question: what remains of a person when almost every choice has been taken away? The answer did not reveal itself immediately. It emerged slowly, through mornings much like this one, through meals too small to satisfy hunger, through letters that arrived months late or never arrived at all, through friendships built over shared bread crusts and whispered conversations after lights out. Captivity was rarely defined by a single dramatic moment. Instead, it accumulated almost invisibly, one ordinary day layered upon another until the extraordinary became routine and the routine became the shape of life itself. As we begin, if you enjoy these slow journeys into the quieter corners of history, you might consider subscribing so you can return for future stories of endurance, memory, and the ordinary lives lived beneath extraordinary circumstances. And now, settle in as we step beyond the wire together. You're listening to Echoes of War. The history of war is often remembered through movement. Armies advance across maps. Ships cross oceans beneath darkened skies. Aircraft disappear into clouds before returning, or failing to return, to waiting airfields. The language of conflict favors motion, measuring victories in miles gained and defeats in ground surrendered. Yet for millions of soldiers captured during the great conflicts of the 20th century, the defining experience of war became something almost impossible to map. Their world contracted until its borders could be walked in minutes, even though escaping those boundaries might remain impossible for years. You might imagine captivity as endless suffering alone, but its greater challenge often lay in something quieter. Human beings are built to make countless unnoticed decisions each day. When to stand, when to eat, where to walk, which direction to look, whom to visit, whether to remain silent or begin a conversation. Freedom is composed as much of these ordinary choices as of grand political ideals, and it is often only when they disappear that their importance becomes visible. Inside a prisoner of war camp, authority extended into the smallest corners of existence, transforming everyday life into a sequence of permissions rather than intentions. The camps themselves reflected the vast geography of global war. Some stood among forests where snow muffled every sound for months at a time, while others baked beneath relentless tropical suns where heat exhausted both body and thought before midday. Barracks varied from hastily erected wooden huts to converted factories, schools, monasteries, or military installations repurposed for confinement. Watchtowers overlooked frozen fields in one country and dusty compounds in another, yet the view from inside always shared one constant feature. Beyond every fence lay a world that continued without those who watched it from within. The men who entered these camps arrived carrying different uniforms, languages, religions, and memories. British infantrymen stood beside Canadians, Australians beside New Zealanders, Americans beside Filipinos, Poles beside Frenchmen, Yugoslavs beside Greeks, Soviets beside countless others whose wars had crossed national borders before ending within the same enclosure. They brought with them habits formed in homes scattered across continents, only to discover that captivity steadily replaced individual routines with institutional ones. Even differences that had once seemed important gradually softened beneath the shared mathematics of hunger, waiting, weather, and uncertainty. This is not a story built around famous escapes or celebrated acts of resistance, remarkable though those moments sometimes were. Instead, it lingers where history often moves too quickly. It remains inside the barracks after evening roll call, beside the cookhouse where thin soup is ladled into dented tins, along muddy paths worn smooth by thousands of careful footsteps, and beneath blankets where conversations fade into silence while another night settles across the camp. It is here, within repetition rather than spectacle, that captivity reveals its deepest truths. The first boundary. The journey toward captivity rarely begins at the camp itself. It begins in the quiet hours after resistance has become impossible, when the sounds of battle retreat into the distance and are replaced by unfamiliar voices speaking unfamiliar commands. Smoke still hangs above damaged fields, vehicles burn where they have been abandoned, and scattered equipment lies across the landscape exactly where exhausted hands last released it. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the war continues moving forward without waiting for those who have fallen behind. For the captured soldier, however, time begins to separate from the rhythm of armies. The campaign continues. His own world becomes smaller with every mile he is marched away from it. Columns of prisoners appeared in nearly every theatre of the Second World War. Following the rapid campaigns in Western Europe during 1940, long files of British, French, Belgian, and Dutch soldiers disappeared into occupied territory. After the fighting in North Africa, men crossed deserts under armed escort before beginning far longer journeys across the Mediterranean and into Europe. On the Eastern Front, the sheer scale of combat produced immense movements of prisoners whose experiences varied dramatically depending upon the circumstances of their capture and the policies of those who held them. In the Pacific, surrender often marked the beginning of ordeals shaped by entirely different assumptions about warfare, honor, and survival. Geography changed almost everything, yet one experience remained strikingly familiar. The moment a soldier ceased directing his own movement, captivity had already begun. You watch one of these columns progress along a narrow country road bordered by bare trees whose branches swayed gently in the morning wind. Frost still covers the ditches, untouched except where boots have broken the surface into dark patches of mud. Every few hundred steps the column slows, then moves again with quiet reluctance, as though each pause briefly allows memory to catch up before the march resumes. Few men speak. Conversation requires energy, and uncertainty often encourages silence more effectively than orders ever could. Many still carry the outward signs of the battles that have only recently ended for them. Uniforms remain stained with mud collected from defensive positions hastily abandoned under artillery fire. Torn sleeves expose makeshift bandages wrapped by comrades whose own medical supplies had nearly disappeared. Some helmets have already been discarded because carrying unnecessary weight across unknown distances serves little purpose once combat is over. Others cling to small personal belongings with remarkable determination: a photograph folded inside a tunic pocket, a prayer book protected beneath a shirt, a wedding ring turned absent-mindedly around a finger during moments when the road becomes long enough for thought to wander home. The guards themselves often appear tired rather than triumphant. They have marched through the same weather, eaten from the same strained supply systems, and slept beneath many of the same skies as those now walking ahead of them. Their responsibilities have changed from defeating an enemy to controlling one. Orders are repeated more frequently than conversations. Distances between prisoners are corrected with gestures that have become routine after weeks or months of escort duty. The relationship remains unmistakably unequal, yet even authority begins to settle into habit when exercised day after day across endless roads leading toward destinations that many guards themselves have never seen. The landscape offers constant reminders that ordinary life continues beyond the column. Farmers repair fences damaged during recent fighting while livestock graze with quiet indifference nearby. Smoke rises from village chimneys where families prepare breakfasts according to routines interrupted but never entirely destroyed by war. Children occasionally appear at gates, watching the prisoners pass before being gently called back indoors. Some civilians avert their eyes altogether, uncertain whether pity, fear, or simple caution best suits such encounters. Others observe openly, trying perhaps to imagine where these weary strangers have come from and where they might be going. The column passes through these moments without stopping, existing briefly within communities to which it no longer belongs. For many prisoners, uncertainty proves heavier than exhaustion. They do not know whether the journey will last another afternoon or another month. They do not know whether they are moving toward a permanent camp, a temporary holding area, or a railway station from which entirely new distances will unfold. Rumors drift quietly through the ranks whenever the guards cannot hear clearly enough to intervene. Someone believes they are heading west. Another insists the destination lies hundreds of kilometers away. Someone else recalls hearing that captured officers are separated from enlisted men. Every possibility feels equally believable because none can yet be tested against reality. In the absence of reliable information, hope and speculation begin sharing the same narrow space. As daylight strengthens, the road itself seems almost to stretch beneath the weight of repeated footsteps. Cart tracks carved into the earth long before the war now guide soldiers who never expected to travel this way. Birds continue moving between hedgerows without recognizing the boundaries humans impose upon one another. A breeze carries the faint scent of damp soil mixed with wood smoke from unseen cottages, reminding every man in the column that the natural world remains astonishingly indifferent to uniforms, victories, and defeats. The seasons continue advancing according to older laws than those written by generals or governments. By evening, temporary halts become opportunities for careful observation rather than genuine rest. Men count companions who remain beside them and quietly notice those who no longer do. Some have fallen behind because of wounds. Others have been diverted elsewhere without explanation. The column has already begun changing shape, not through dramatic events but through the slow erosion that accompanies prolonged movement under control. Captivity, they are beginning to understand, is not announced by a single locked gate. It arrives gradually, one surrendered certainty after another, until even the direction of tomorrow belongs to someone else. The railway station appears almost without warning, emerging beyond a curve in the road where rows of telegraph poles converge toward the horizon. It is not a grand terminal built to celebrate movement, but a practical place of freight platforms, weathered warehouses, water towers, and sidings where locomotives spend more time waiting than traveling. Before the war, trains arriving here might have carried livestock, timber, coal, or families visiting distant relatives. Now the station has acquired another purpose. It has become one more quiet mechanism within the machinery of captivity. You watch the prisoners guided onto a platform already marked by countless previous arrivals. The timber beneath their boots has absorbed years of rain, coal dust, spilled grain, and now the slow procession of military columns moving in every direction across a continent at war. The station master continues his work with measured precision, consulting schedules that no longer concern holiday travelers but military logistics. Freight wagons stand coupled together beneath drifting smoke, their iron fittings cold enough to gather beads of moisture that glisten in the weak morning light. Everything here suggests organization rather than haste. Even captivity depends upon timetables. For many prisoners, this is the first moment when distance becomes truly impossible to measure. Roads at least reveal villages, rivers, hills, and changing skies. Railways remove those familiar points of reference. Once the doors close and the train begins moving, direction loses its certainty. A man may know whether the sun rises on his left or right, yet clouds, forests, tunnels, and fatigue gradually dissolve even those simple observations. Maps that once guided military campaigns become useless inside a crowded freight wagon. The wagons themselves differ according to place and circumstance. Some are ordinary freight cars hastily adapted for transporting large numbers of men. Others contain rough wooden benches running along the sides, while many offer little more than bare planked floors worn smooth by years of commercial use before the war transformed their purpose. Narrow openings near the roof admit strips of pale daylight together with cold air or summer heat, depending upon the season. Every movement of the train produces a chorus of timber creaking against iron, wheels striking rail joints with patient regularity, and loose fittings rattling in rhythms that gradually become impossible to ignore. Inside, people begin arranging themselves with quiet efficiency. Those nearest the walls surrender a little space so others may sit. Canteens are passed carefully between unfamiliar hands. Someone unwraps a final piece of bread saved from the previous day, dividing it into portions too small to satisfy anyone but large enough to remind everyone that sharing remains possible. These gestures carry no ceremony. They emerge naturally from the practical understanding that cooperation consumes less strength than conflict when no one can leave the wagon until another authority decides otherwise. Conversation rises and falls with the movement of the train. Men exchange fragments of information gathered during capture, each story incomplete yet offered sincerely. A British corporal recalls hearing that prisoner camps in Germany follow established regulations. A Polish soldier quietly wonders whether his family still remains in the town he left months earlier. A French sergeant speaks of harvest seasons on his father's farm, describing fields so vividly that several listeners briefly close their eyes, allowing memory to substitute for the landscape now hidden beyond rough wooden walls. No one knows whose account is most accurate, yet certainty has become less valuable than companionship itself. You notice how quickly small routines begin forming even before the destination has been reached. A corner near the wagon door is kept clear for practical necessity. Water is rationed without anyone needing formal instructions. Those who remain standing shift positions at intervals to ease cramped legs, while older men are quietly encouraged toward places where they may lean against solid timber during the longest stretches of travel. Without discussion, an unfamiliar collection of individuals begins behaving like a temporary community, not because affection has already grown, but because shared discomfort gently teaches cooperation. Outside, the countryside continues unfolding beyond narrow slits in the timber. Forests replace villages, then fields return once more before giving way to rivers crossed upon steel bridges whose shadows briefly darken the interior of the wagon. Church towers appear in the distance before disappearing behind hills. Farmers continue working behind horses or tractors, pausing only occasionally to watch another military train pass toward destinations known only to railway officials and military headquarters. The ordinary world remains astonishingly close, separated not by great distance but by walls, locks, and circumstance. Hours become difficult to distinguish from one another. The rhythm of the wheels settles into something almost hypnotic, neither comforting nor threatening, simply constant. Hunger arrives gradually rather than dramatically. Thirst becomes more noticeable each time the train stops without explanation at isolated sidings where locomotives take on water or allow other traffic to pass. During these pauses, silence often settles across the wagons. Men listen for clues carried by voices outside, hoping an overheard place name or familiar accent might reveal where they have been taken. Usually, the train moves again before certainty can emerge. As evening approaches, light entering through the narrow openings softens into amber before fading toward gray. Faces become less distinct inside the wagon, though breathing, shifting blankets, and quiet coughs continue marking the presence of every occupant. Beyond the walls, another landscape slips unnoticed into darkness. Ahead, somewhere beyond tracks stretching into the night, stands a camp whose fences have already been built, whose barracks already shelter other prisoners, and whose routines have been unfolding for months or perhaps years. The men inside the wagon cannot yet imagine the shape of that place. They know only that every mile traveled carries them farther from the lives they understood, and closer to an existence governed by rules they have not yet learned. Behind the wire. The train slows long before it comes to a complete stop. Its wheels no longer strike the rails with the steady confidence of long-distance travel, but with shorter, more deliberate movements as it enters sidings built for freight rather than passengers. Somewhere outside, points shift beneath the weight of iron, producing a heavy metallic clatter that echoes through the wagons before fading into the still air of early morning. No announcement follows. The only signal that the journey has reached another stage is the quiet awareness that motion itself has begun to disappear. When the doors finally slide open, cold air enters first. It carries the smell of damp earth, coal smoke, wet timber, and something less easily described, the scent of many people living within a confined place for a very long time. After hours spent inside crowded wagons, the air feels unusually clear despite the smoke hanging above nearby chimneys. Men blink against pale daylight that seems brighter than memory, though the sky itself remains overcast beneath a blanket of low grey cloud. You watch them climb down carefully, legs stiff from confinement, each movement slower than it would have been only days earlier. Some pause instinctively to stretch before remembering that every action now unfolds beneath observation. Around the railway siding stand guards whose expressions reveal neither celebration nor anger. They have performed this reception countless times before. Their instructions are brief, their gestures economical. New arrivals appear not as unexpected visitors but as another scheduled delivery within an institution that has settled into routine. Beyond the siding stretches the camp itself. At first glance, it seems almost ordinary in its geometry. Long wooden barracks stand arranged in neat rows separated by worn paths of compacted earth. Utility buildings cluster near administrative offices. Storage sheds, workshops, kitchens, washhouses, and infirmaries each occupy their assigned place within a carefully planned layout. Nothing appears accidental. Every structure has been positioned according to practical necessity rather than comfort, creating an environment whose greatest characteristic is not cruelty alone, but order. The fences draw the eye only after everything else has been noticed. Double lines of barbed wire surround the compound, rising higher than a person's reach and interrupted at regular intervals by watchtowers whose narrow windows overlook every corner of the perimeter. Between the fences lies an empty strip of ground where grass has long since disappeared beneath countless patrols and changing seasons. The space seems strangely quiet, almost peaceful in appearance, yet everyone understands that it exists precisely because no one is meant to enter it. A boundary becomes most powerful when it rarely needs to be tested. For those arriving, the first hours are filled with procedures rather than explanations. Columns form and reform outside administrative buildings where names, ranks, serial numbers, and units are recorded with patient efficiency. International agreements governing prisoners of war required certain information to be documented, and many camps maintained meticulous records despite the immense pressures imposed by wartime administration. Clerks bend over ledgers already thick with entries written in different inks across different months. Every page represents another life translated into orderly handwriting. Possessions gradually begin disappearing into separate piles. Military equipment has already been surrendered long before reaching the camp, but personal belongings now receive closer attention. Pocket knives, compasses, notebooks, watches, pens, family photographs, religious medals, letters carried through entire campaigns, small souvenirs gathered during quieter days before capture, all are examined according to regulations that vary from camp to camp and from nation to nation. Some items remain with their owners. Others are confiscated temporarily or permanently. The process rarely involves raised voices. It proceeds with the quiet certainty of bureaucracy performing its accustomed work. You notice how carefully many prisoners watch these inspections, not because they expect every possession to be preserved, but because ordinary objects have suddenly become extensions of memory itself. A worn fountain pen may no longer be useful for military reports, yet it still recalls evenings spent writing home. A photograph folded at its corners contains more than an image. It preserves a version of life untouched by fences and guard towers. Even the simplest belongings carry invisible weight once the familiar world has begun slipping beyond reach. Clothing receives equal attention. Torn uniforms are noted. Boots are inspected. Medical conditions become visible as men stand waiting beneath open skies, revealing wounds that battlefield urgency had allowed little time to examine properly. Camp doctors and orderlies, themselves often working with limited supplies, perform initial assessments intended less to provide immediate treatment than to determine where each new arrival belongs within the institution. Healthy prisoners may soon be assigned to labor detachments. Those weakened by wounds or illness move toward infirmaries whose resources are seldom equal to the needs awaiting them. Throughout these procedures, the camp continues functioning around the newcomers with almost unsettling normality. Smoke rises steadily from kitchen chimneys as meals are prepared according to fixed schedules. Somewhere beyond the registration area, a hammer strikes within measured intervals from a maintenance workshop. Laundry hangs between buildings where the morning breeze slowly dries uniforms patched and repatched over many months. Older prisoners walk familiar paths carrying buckets, tools, or bundles of firewood, scarcely glancing toward the latest arrivals because they remember, perhaps too clearly, standing in exactly the same uncertain place themselves. The realization comes quietly rather than dramatically. This camp did not begin today. It possesses its own history, routines, friendships, arguments, seasons, and memories entirely independent of those who have only now entered through its gates. The newcomers have not arrived at the beginning of captivity. They have stepped into the middle of an already existing world, one whose rhythms will continue tomorrow regardless of how quickly or slowly they learn to follow them. Once registration has ended, movement through the camp becomes slower and more deliberate. The urgency that surrounded transport and processing gradually gives way to something quieter, as though the institution itself has taken a long breath after receiving its newest inhabitants. Small groups are led toward barracks assigned according to nationality, rank, available space, or the administrative needs of the camp. The paths beneath their boots are no longer unfamiliar because they have never been walked before. They are unfamiliar because they have been walked by thousands of others whose footsteps have worn away every blade of grass. The barracks appear almost identical from the outside. Their walls are built from rough timber darkened by years of rain, frost, summer heat, and coal smoke drifting across the compound. Roofs sag slightly beneath repeated winters, while windows patched with mismatched panes allow pale daylight to enter without ever quite overcoming the dimness inside. Small stoves stand at intervals along the buildings, their chimneys releasing thin columns of smoke that disappear into the low clouds. Fuel is precious, and warmth seldom reaches every corner equally. Even before crossing the threshold, a newcomer can sense that comfort has long since surrendered to practicality. You follow the men inside as the door closes behind them with a dull wooden thud. The room stretches farther than expected, lined with rows of bunks built 3 levels high from unfinished timber. Blankets folded upon each sleeping place vary in age and condition, some carefully repaired with patches that reveal years of patient use. The air carries the familiar scent of damp clothing drying near the stove, mingled with soap, worn leather, smoke, and the lingering aroma of cabbage from an earlier meal. None of these smells dominates. Together they have become the ordinary atmosphere of prolonged captivity. Older prisoners glance toward the newcomers with measured curiosity rather than surprise. New arrivals are part of camp life, just as departures through exchange, transfer, liberation, illness, or death have also become familiar. Introductions are brief. A place to sleep is indicated with a nod rather than ceremony. Someone points toward shelves where eating tins are kept. Another quietly explains which stove draws well and which one fills the room with smoke whenever the wind changes direction. These fragments of practical knowledge are offered without flourish because they have proven more valuable than dramatic speeches. Survival often begins with understanding the smallest details of an unfamiliar room. Beds quickly become more than places to sleep. They define a person's small territory within an environment where almost nothing belongs to the individual. A blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bunk, boots positioned beneath the frame, a mug resting on a narrow shelf, perhaps one permitted photograph tucked carefully between boards. Such arrangements seem insignificant when viewed from outside, yet inside the camp they quietly restore a measure of personal order. Where larger choices have disappeared, smaller ones acquire unexpected importance. The architecture itself shapes daily existence. Every cough during the night travels through the timber before fading into the darkness. Conversations held near the entrance drift toward the far wall, becoming softer but rarely disappearing altogether. Rain striking the roof produces one sound during autumn, another beneath heavy snow, and yet another when spring begins loosening winter's grip. The building slowly teaches its occupants to recognize weather without stepping outdoors. Long before dawn, experienced prisoners often know whether frost has settled, whether wind has shifted direction, or whether fresh rain has begun falling beyond the walls. You notice that the camp possesses countless boundaries beyond its fences. Some are official, marked by signs or regulations that determine where prisoners may walk, assemble, or work. Others exist only through habit. Certain benches are always occupied by the same group after evening meals. Particular corners of the barracks remain quieter because men write letters there whenever paper becomes available. A place beside the stove naturally belongs to those drying soaked boots after labor details return. Without anyone formally deciding these customs, repetition has transformed shared space into a landscape of quiet expectations. Outside, the afternoon unfolds according to schedules established long before this particular transport arrived. Smoke thickens above the kitchens as another meal approaches. Water buckets move steadily between pumps and buildings. Maintenance crews replace damaged fence posts worn by weather rather than escape attempts. Guards continue their patrols along familiar routes, exchanging brief greetings with one another as shifts change beneath the watchtowers. Even the camp dogs seem to know the routine, lifting their heads only occasionally before settling once more beside guardhouses warmed by iron stoves. For the newcomer, perhaps the most unsettling discovery is not the presence of guards or barbed wire. It is the realization that so many people already understand exactly where they should be at every hour of the day. They rise before the whistle sounds because their bodies have learned its timing. They queue before meals without needing instruction. They collect tools, report for labor, clean their living spaces, mend clothing, write letters, and prepare for evening roll call with an efficiency that only long familiarity can produce. What initially appeared to be imprisonment alone now reveals itself as something larger, an entire society organized within confinement. As daylight begins fading beyond the windows, lamps are lit one by one inside the barracks. Their soft yellow light falls across timber polished by countless hands, illuminating faces that carry different languages yet increasingly similar expressions of patient endurance. Outside, the fences remain exactly where they stood that morning, but another boundary has quietly taken shape. The newcomers have crossed from simply being captured into belonging, however unwillingly, to the daily life of the camp itself. Tomorrow will not begin with discovery. It will begin with routine. The shape of the day. Morning does not begin with the sunrise. It begins with expectation. Long before the first whistle sounds across the compound, there are already small movements inside the barracks as men wake almost simultaneously, their bodies having surrendered to a rhythm that no longer belongs to their own choosing. Someone pulls a blanket more tightly around his shoulders against the lingering cold. Another sits quietly on the edge of a bunk, waiting for the signal that will soon arrive. Boots touch the floor with practiced care, not from fear of making noise, but because hundreds of mornings have taught that unnecessary haste gains nothing. The whistle finally cuts through the darkness with remarkable clarity. It is neither especially loud nor dramatic, yet it carries complete authority because it marks the beginning of another day whose structure has already been decided. Across the camp, doors open almost together. Men emerge into air that might be sharp with winter frost, heavy with autumn rain, or already warm beneath a summer sky. The seasons change, but the sequence rarely does. Captivity possesses a calendar, yet it is the routine rather than the date that shapes each morning. You watch the prisoners gather outside their barracks, arranging themselves into familiar formations before the first count of the day. Roll call appears simple from a distance. Lines of men stand quietly while officials verify names or numbers against carefully maintained records. Yet the process carries greater significance than administration alone. Every count quietly reaffirms the institution's control over space and movement. Every individual who stood in the same position yesterday is expected to stand there again today. Absence demands explanation. Presence becomes the ordinary proof that captivity continues uninterrupted. Weather often transforms these moments more than any spoken order. Winter mornings leave breath hanging above the assembled rows like pale smoke that slowly dissolves into the cold air. Frost stiffens clothing not fully dried after the previous day's labor. Boots freeze against compacted earth until constant shifting becomes necessary simply to preserve feeling in tired feet. During heavy rain, water gathers beneath collars, trickles into sleeves, and pools around the soles of worn footwear while the count proceeds with patient indifference. Summer replaces cold with heat that settles across the compound before breakfast has even been served, bringing dust instead of mud and flies instead of ice. The routine remains constant while nature quietly alters the experience of enduring it. Breakfast follows according to schedules that differ between camps but share a common characteristic. It is rarely hurried because there is little reason for haste. Queues form outside kitchens where steam escapes from large cooking vessels into the cool morning air. Tin mugs and dented bowls pass steadily from hand to hand as ladles measure portions with mechanical consistency. The meal itself is often modest. Coffee substitutes brewed from roasted grains, thin soup, bread whose quality depends upon both local resources and the fortunes of wartime supply systems. No one expects abundance. Attention instead turns toward making every portion last a little longer than appetite believes possible. The kitchens become places of quiet observation rather than conversation. Experienced prisoners instinctively notice changes almost too small for outsiders to recognize. A loaf slightly larger than yesterday's suggests a fortunate delivery has arrived. A thinner soup may indicate shortages elsewhere within the camp or disruptions beyond its fences. Even the type of vegetable floating near the surface becomes information, connecting the enclosed world of captivity to harvests, transport networks, military priorities, and weather patterns unfolding across countries the prisoners can no longer see. Meals nourish the body, but they also become one of the few remaining ways to measure the changing condition of the wider war. After breakfast, the camp begins separating into its daily functions. Labor detachments assemble near workshops or gates leading beyond the compound. Others remain inside to perform maintenance essential for the camp's own operation. Carpenters repair bunks weakened by years of use. Tailors carefully patch uniforms whose original fabric has nearly disappeared beneath layers of patient mending. Cooks prepare the next meal long before the previous one has settled. Medical orderlies move between infirmary buildings carrying bandages, water, or scarce medicines with deliberate economy. Even those officially exempt from labor because of illness or injury often seek small tasks, for inactivity can become as burdensome as physical work when repeated day after day. You begin to notice that every object inside the camp lives a second life. A boot is repaired again instead of replaced. A blanket is turned over so the less worn side faces upward. A broken bucket receives another handle fashioned from scrap wire. Pieces of timber removed from damaged buildings reappear as shelves, stools, walking sticks, or fuel for the stove. Waste becomes unusually rare, not because resources were always unavailable before captivity, but because every useful material now carries the possibility of extending comfort, preserving strength, or solving tomorrow's unexpected problem. Necessity quietly teaches an attentiveness that peace seldom demands. As the morning advances, the sounds of the camp settle into their familiar arrangement. Hammers strike wood from distant workshops. Boots move steadily across gravel paths. Smoke rises from chimneys with reassuring regularity. Somewhere a saw cuts patiently through rough timber while a kettle whistles briefly before falling silent again. None of these sounds dominates the others. Together they form the ordinary music of an institution that has learned to sustain itself through repetition. For those who have lived within it long enough, the absence of one familiar sound can become more unsettling than the presence of many unfamiliar ones. By late morning, the extraordinary experience of imprisonment has once again disguised itself as ordinary life. The fences still stand beyond every building, the watchtowers continue their silent observation, and the gates remain locked exactly as they were yesterday. Yet most eyes no longer rest upon them. Attention has shifted toward the smaller realities that fill the hours between dawn and dusk. The camp has begun teaching its oldest lesson, that human beings, even when deprived of freedom, possess an extraordinary ability to organize their days around whatever fragments of normality remain. As the morning gradually gives way to afternoon, the rhythm of the camp becomes less visible precisely because it has become so familiar. There are no dramatic transitions announcing the next part of the day. Instead, work continues until tools are briefly laid aside, footsteps gradually converge toward the kitchens once more, and the smell of cooking begins drifting across the compound with remarkable consistency. The passage of time is measured less by clocks than by repeated activities whose sequence rarely changes, allowing even newly arrived prisoners to estimate the hour simply by watching the movement of those around them. Midday meals are rarely memorable for their abundance, yet they occupy an important place within the emotional landscape of captivity. Hunger sharpens attention to ordinary details that might once have passed unnoticed. The warmth rising from a bowl held between cold hands offers comfort that extends beyond nutrition. Steam briefly softens chilled faces before disappearing into the air. Conversations often remain subdued while people eat, not because companionship is absent, but because food deserves complete attention whenever supplies are uncertain. Every spoonful is consumed carefully, every crust of bread accounted for, every drop preserved rather than discarded. You notice that eating has become a remarkably orderly activity. Men instinctively leave enough space for others within crowded dining areas or along improvised benches outside the barracks during warmer months. Empty bowls are stacked without instruction. Utensils are cleaned with patient care despite limited water. Habits that might once have reflected simple politeness now serve a broader purpose. Shared order reduces unnecessary conflict in a place where privacy has nearly disappeared. Courtesy, even in its smallest forms, quietly preserves dignity. After the meal, there is often a brief interval before work resumes. These moments, though short, acquire significance out of proportion to their length. Some prisoners sit with their backs against sun-warmed walls whenever weather permits, closing their eyes not to sleep but simply to feel warmth upon their faces without immediate obligation. Others inspect boots worn thin by months of marching and labor, replacing loose stitching with thread salvaged from damaged clothing. A few unfold carefully protected letters, reading familiar words once more despite knowing every sentence by memory. The paper itself has become precious, carrying not only messages but the unmistakable handwriting of people whose voices have grown increasingly difficult to remember. Mail occupies a unique place within prisoner of war camps. When international conditions allowed, organizations such as the Red Cross help facilitate correspondence between prisoners and their families, though letters often traveled across continents before finally arriving months after they had been written. Entire conversations unfolded through remarkable delay. A wife might describe autumn harvests while her husband read the letter during spring. Parents celebrated birthdays their sons had already passed in captivity. Children learned to write between one letter and the next. The words themselves remained unchanged, yet time transformed every message into both news and history simultaneously. You watch one prisoner carefully fold a letter before placing it inside a small cloth pouch stitched into the lining of his jacket. He has read it dozens of times already, perhaps hundreds, yet the ritual never becomes careless. Others possess no letters at all, either because correspondence has not yet reached them or because no one knows where to send it. Even so, they often sit beside those fortunate enough to receive mail, listening quietly as familiar names, village streets, harvest seasons, and ordinary domestic concerns briefly re-enter the camp through spoken memory. For a few minutes, distant homes exist alongside wooden barracks and barbed wire without either diminishing the reality of the other. The afternoon also reveals how knowledge circulates within confinement. Newspapers occasionally arrive after careful censorship, stripped of military information yet still carrying fragments of the outside world. Rumors fill the spaces where verified facts remain unavailable. Someone believes a particular city has fallen. Another insists peace negotiations are being discussed somewhere beyond the front. A newly arrived prisoner recalls conditions in another camp many hundreds of kilometers away. These fragments pass quietly from group to group, changing slightly with each retelling, until certainty becomes impossible to separate from hope. Yet the conversations continue because remaining entirely without news would feel even more unsettling than living with uncertainty. As labor resumes, the camp settles once more into its patient routine. Workshops echo with measured hammer blows. Gardens cultivated by prisoners produce modest vegetables wherever soil and regulations permit. Water is drawn from pumps whose handles have been polished smooth by thousands of hands. Laundry lines gradually fill with patched uniforms swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. None of these activities promises freedom, yet each quietly resists the complete erosion of ordinary life. Repairing a chair, tending a small garden, or mending a torn sleeve becomes more than practical work. It becomes evidence that the future, however limited, is still expected to arrive. The guards, too, become part of this daily landscape. Shifts change at predictable hours. Boots follow familiar patrol routes between towers and gates. Conversations pass briefly between sentries before one continues his circuit while another disappears into the guardhouse to warm his hands beside a stove. Most interactions with prisoners remain formal and restrained, shaped by regulations as much as by personality. Over time, faces become recognizable even when names do not. The institution gradually teaches everyone within its boundaries, not only prisoners, but also those assigned to watch them, that repetition possesses its own quiet authority. As daylight slowly begins its descent, shadows lengthen across the open spaces between the barracks. The fences cast dark parallel lines upon the ground, stretching farther with each passing hour before gradually dissolving into the approaching evening. You begin to understand that captivity is sustained not only by locked gates or armed guards, but by the remarkable consistency of countless ordinary days arranged almost exactly like the one before them. Routine has become the invisible architecture of the camp, shaping thought as surely as timber shapes the barracks and wire shapes the perimeter. Within that architecture, every prisoner now learns to measure life not by freedom regained, but by another day carefully endured. The camp within the camp. After enough weeks have passed, the camp begins revealing structures that cannot be seen from a watchtower. A visitor standing outside the fences would observe barracks, kitchens, workshops, and rows of men moving according to carefully enforced schedules. From above, the institution appears orderly, almost mathematical in its arrangement. Yet beneath that visible order another landscape gradually emerges, one shaped not by architects or military regulations, but by the countless small decisions made by people adapting to prolonged confinement. It is quieter than the official camp, less clearly defined, and yet no less real. You notice it first in the spaces between routine rather than within it. After evening meals, certain benches slowly gather the same familiar faces. One corner of a barracks becomes known for quiet conversation because its stove holds warmth longer than the others. Another area remains almost entirely devoted to reading whenever books become available, while a narrow table beneath a window attracts those who write letters beneath the best natural light. No signs announce these places. No regulations assign them. Repetition alone has transformed ordinary corners into shared territory. The longer someone remains imprisoned, the more important these unwritten arrangements become. Official rules determine where a prisoner must sleep, when he must stand for roll call, and when he may receive food. Unofficial customs determine something equally valuable, where he feels momentarily at ease. In a world where personal choice has become exceptionally scarce, even selecting the same place beside the stove each evening quietly restores a fragment of autonomy. Freedom, reduced to its smallest surviving pieces, begins living inside habits. The camp population itself grows increasingly varied with time. Men captured during entirely different campaigns now find themselves sharing the same enclosure despite having entered the war years apart. A British pilot shot down over occupied Europe may sleep only a few bunks away from an infantryman captured in North Africa. Nearby rests a sailor whose convoy disappeared beneath Atlantic waves before rescue gave way to imprisonment. Elsewhere, artillerymen, engineers, signalers, medics, drivers, cooks, musicians, teachers, miners, students, and farmers gradually discover that military rank has not entirely erased the occupations they once practiced in civilian life. These earlier identities quietly begin resurfacing. The schoolteacher naturally explains unfamiliar languages to others who wish to learn a few useful words. A carpenter studies damaged furniture before reaching instinctively for tools. Doctors continue treating illness with whatever limited supplies remain available, assisted by nurses or medical orderlies who carried the same responsibilities before capture. Tailors repair clothing with remarkable patience. Bakers discuss recipes remembered from home despite possessing neither ovens nor ingredients with which to recreate them. The camp does not erase who these people were. Instead, it compresses those identities into smaller spaces where they continue existing almost unnoticed. You watch an elderly French prisoner carefully showing a younger Canadian how to reinforce worn boot soles using scraps of leather recovered from damaged equipment no longer worth official repair. The lesson unfolds without ceremony. Hands move patiently while conversation drifts toward weather, harvests, and distant villages rather than military campaigns. Nearby, another group quietly exchanges language lessons. English words are repeated beside Polish, Dutch beside French, each pronunciation corrected with gentle amusement rather than formal instruction. There are no classrooms here, yet learning persists because curiosity survives confinement more easily than might be expected. Commerce, too, develops its own restrained character. Money rarely possesses much practical value inside the camp itself, but exchange never entirely disappears. Soap may be traded for sewing thread. A portion of bread saved today might become assistance tomorrow when another prisoner falls ill. Cigarettes, when available, often function less as objects of leisure than as an informal currency understood by everyone regardless of nationality. The purpose of such exchanges is seldom profit alone. More often they quietly redistribute scarce resources according to trust, reputation, and mutual need. This emerging society remains fragile. Supplies are limited. Tempers occasionally fray beneath the steady pressure of uncertainty and exhaustion. Small misunderstandings carry greater weight than they might in ordinary life because there are so few opportunities to withdraw from one another. Privacy has become almost entirely communal. Grief unfolds among witnesses. Illness is rarely hidden. Even silence is shared because dozens of people sleep within the same room, listening to the same wind moving across the same roof every night. Yet precisely because life is so closely shared, acts of consideration acquire unusual significance. Someone leaves an extra spoonful of soup for a man recovering from fever. Another quietly repairs a broken button before its owner notices it missing. A blanket is adjusted over sleeping shoulders after the stove burns low during the night. None of these gestures changes the larger reality of captivity. The fences remain where they have always stood. The guards continue their patrols beyond the windows. But inside the human landscape developing beneath those larger structures, another truth slowly takes root. Survival is becoming something carried collectively as much as individually. The institution had intended to organize prisoners according to regulations, numbers, and barracks. The prisoners themselves, almost without realizing it, have begun organizing life according to memory, skill, kindness, obligation, and quiet reciprocity. Within the official camp, another camp has gradually appeared, one built not from timber and wire, but from relationships patient enough to endure another ordinary day. As weeks become months, the quiet society growing inside the camp begins to develop traditions of its own. They are rarely written down, seldom acknowledged by the authorities, and often so ordinary that a newcomer might overlook them entirely. Yet these customs slowly become part of the emotional architecture of captivity. They remind the prisoners that while the institution governs their movements, it does not entirely determine how they relate to one another. Evening is when this hidden world becomes most visible. After the final labor details return and the last meal has been eaten, the pace of the camp softens. Smoke drifts steadily from the barrack chimneys, carrying with it the scent of damp firewood and coal of uneven quality. Lamps cast warm circles of light across rough wooden tables scarred by years of use. Outside, the watchtowers remain alert against the darkening sky, but inside the barracks another kind of attention begins to unfold, one directed not toward escape or survival alone, but toward preserving the habits of ordinary humanity. You watch a group gather around a chessboard carved from scraps of timber by prisoners who had once worked as cabinet makers. The pieces do not match perfectly. Some pawns are slightly taller than others, and one bishop has clearly been repaired after breaking along the grain of the wood. None of this seems important. The game proceeds slowly, interrupted by quiet conversation rather than competition. Around them, others sew torn clothing beneath dim light, polish boots that have already survived more winters than anyone expected, or simply sit listening to the familiar sounds of the room. The activity matters less than the continuity it creates. Books, whenever they can be obtained, circulate patiently from hand to hand. International relief organizations occasionally supply reading material, and in many camps prisoners gradually build modest libraries assembled from donations, exchanges, and volumes carried across remarkable distances. A novel may pass through dozens of readers before its binding finally begins to loosen. Histories, poetry, religious texts, technical manuals, and dictionaries all find unexpected audiences because reading offers more than information. It restores the experience of choosing where the mind will travel, even when the body cannot follow. Where books remain scarce, memory itself becomes a library. A university professor recites passages from literature remembered almost word for word after years of teaching. A priest quietly recalls psalms during evening prayers attended by men from different denominations who find comfort simply in familiar rhythms of speech. A musician taps gentle patterns upon the edge of a bunk while describing compositions he can no longer hear performed except within memory. Elsewhere, stories from childhood villages, family kitchens, fishing boats, farms, factories, and classrooms are repeated often enough that listeners begin anticipating each familiar detail. The telling is not diminished by repetition. On the contrary, repetition protects these memories from fading. You notice how often conversation turns toward ordinary life rather than military experience. Battles are discussed when necessary, but they seldom dominate the evenings. Instead, prisoners speak about gardens left untended, favorite walking routes through hometowns, the smell of fresh bread before dawn, the sound of church bells drifting across quiet streets, or the first snowfall that usually arrived each winter where they grew up. Such conversations do not deny the reality of war. They quietly preserve a reality that existed before it. The passing of seasons reinforces this habit of remembrance. Spring is recognized not because freedom approaches, but because birds return to the trees beyond the perimeter and the frozen ground gradually softens beneath careful footsteps. Summer brings longer evenings when conversations continue outside until fading light finally sends everyone indoors. Autumn announces itself through damp mornings, drifting leaves caught against the wire, and the smell of smoke growing stronger as stoves begin working harder once again. Winter closes around the camp with remarkable patience, shortening the days until darkness arrives before many have finished the work assigned to them. The calendar is no longer marked by holidays alone. It is written into the landscape itself. Celebrations, when they occur, are often remarkably modest. A small portion of carefully saved food shared among friends. A handmade decoration fashioned from scraps of paper during Christmas. A birthday remembered because someone quietly kept count of the passing months. A choir assembled from willing voices singing softly enough that the music never competes with the surrounding silence. These occasions do not erase hardship. Instead, they create brief interruptions in its monotony, reminding everyone present that marking the passage of time remains one of the oldest human customs. The camp authorities sometimes tolerated such activities, recognizing that orderly occupations often reduce tension within crowded compounds. At other times, regulations shifted unexpectedly, restricting gatherings or confiscating items judged inappropriate. The boundaries of acceptable behavior could change with new commandants, changing military circumstances, or simple administrative decisions. Yet even when interrupted, the habits themselves often returned. Human beings possess an extraordinary tendency to rebuild familiar routines whenever circumstances allow. As darkness settles fully across the compound, lamps are extinguished one after another until only the faint glow from the stove remains visible inside the barracks. Conversations fade into whispers before disappearing altogether beneath the steady breathing of men preparing for another day that will resemble this one in many ways. Outside, the guards continue walking their familiar routes beneath stars that belong equally to both sides of the wire. Inside, something less visible has become firmly established. The prisoners have begun creating not merely ways to survive together, but ways to remain recognizably human together. It is a quiet achievement, easily overlooked from beyond the fences, yet perhaps one of the most remarkable forms of endurance found anywhere within the history of captivity. The weight of waiting. Waiting is often imagined as the absence of action. Inside a prisoner of war camp, it gradually reveals itself as a form of labor. It asks the mind to carry uncertainty across days that resemble one another so closely they begin to blur, while quietly resisting the temptation to measure every hour against an unknown future. Unlike marching, digging, repairing, or carrying timber, waiting leaves no visible mark upon the hands. Its effects appear elsewhere, in the slower rhythm of conversation, the careful management of expectation, and the remarkable discipline required to continue believing that time still leads somewhere beyond the fences. The first weeks of captivity are often occupied by adjustment. Every object, every regulation, every building demands attention simply because it is unfamiliar. Months later, familiarity itself becomes the challenge. The path between the barracks and the kitchens is now walked almost without conscious thought. The sound of the morning whistle no longer startles anyone awake. Faces that once belonged to strangers have settled naturally into the landscape of everyday life. It is precisely this stability that introduces a quieter question. If tomorrow resembles today, and today resembles yesterday, how should a person continue imagining the future? You watch a prisoner pause beside the fence after returning from the day's work. He does not stand close enough to invite attention from the guards, nor does he examine the wire as though searching for weakness. Instead, His gaze rests beyond the perimeter where a line of poplar trees bends gently in the afternoon wind. Beyond them lies farmland already beginning another growing season. The fields change color from month to month, crops rise and disappear beneath the harvest, and birds continue tracing familiar routes across the open sky. The world beyond the camp moves steadily forward, while inside, the same paths are worn deeper beneath the same careful footsteps. Hope changes its character under such conditions. During the first days after capture, many prisoners imagine that liberation may arrive quickly through military victory, prisoner exchange, or an unexpected change in the front lines. As weeks become months, those expectations quietly adjust themselves to experience. Hope does not disappear altogether. It simply becomes less dramatic. Rather than asking whether freedom will arrive tomorrow, many begin asking a gentler question. How should one live well enough today to be ready whenever tomorrow finally comes? Letters continue shaping this quiet recalibration. News from home rarely travels quickly enough to answer immediate concerns, yet each envelope carries proof that another world still remembers those living behind the wire. Families describe harvests completed, children growing taller, new houses built beside familiar roads, neighbors called into military service, old neighbors returning unexpectedly, illnesses overcome, weddings celebrated in modest circumstances, and ordinary domestic concerns that might once have seemed almost trivial. Read inside the camp, these details become extraordinary. They describe a life still unfolding beyond captivity, reminding every reader that history continues even when personal movement has ceased. Not every prisoner receives such reassurance. Some wait for names to be called during mail distribution only to return repeatedly to their bunks empty-handed. Others know that the fighting has swept through their hometowns so many times that they no longer know whether letters could possibly reach the people they love. Entire countries have changed governments since their capture. Borders have shifted. Cities have been bombed, liberated, occupied again, or left almost unrecognizable. In these circumstances, uncertainty extends beyond personal freedom to encompass the fate of entire families whose circumstances remain hidden behind silence. You notice how carefully experienced prisoners speak to those burdened by such uncertainty. False optimism rarely survives long inside a camp because reality eventually exposes it. Yet complete despair proves equally unhelpful. Instead, conversation often settles into something quieter, a practical encouragement to remain occupied, to continue writing even without receiving replies, to repair clothing before it becomes unusable, to accept invitations for shared meals or evening discussions rather than withdrawing entirely into solitude. These suggestions are rarely presented as profound wisdom. They are simply habits discovered through experience, small routines that prevent waiting from consuming every corner of the day. Rumors continue moving through the camp with remarkable persistence. Someone has overheard guards discussing advances on a distant front. Another believes aircraft passing overhead indicate changing military fortunes. A newly transferred prisoner carries stories from another camp where everyone seemed convinced the war would end before winter. Each account arrives incomplete, acquiring confidence or doubt as it passes quietly between barracks. The prisoners listen with careful interest, but many also learn to hold such news gently, allowing possibility without surrendering themselves entirely to expectation. The camp itself seems almost to understand this emotional rhythm. Morning routines proceed exactly as before regardless of the latest rumors. Soup is served according to schedule whether victories are reported or defeats imagined. Roll calls continue beneath rain, sunshine, snow, and changing political fortunes alike. The institution remains stubbornly indifferent to speculation, insisting through its daily routine that today must still be lived before tomorrow can be known. As evening approaches, you begin to recognize that waiting inside the camp is not empty time. It is filled continuously with decisions so small they might escape notice elsewhere. To rise when the whistle sounds despite exhaustion. To mend another tear instead of leaving it until later. To write another letter whose destination cannot be guaranteed. To listen patiently while another prisoner speaks of home for the 100th time because repeating memory keeps it alive. None of these actions shortens captivity. Yet together they quietly transform waiting from passive endurance into a deliberate way of living. As captivity lengthens, time itself begins to change its texture. Days remain easy to recognize because they are filled with familiar routines, yet months become surprisingly difficult to separate from one another. A prisoner may remember with perfect clarity the sound of rain striking the roof during a particular autumn evening or the smell of fresh-cut timber brought into the workshop one spring morning, while struggling to recall whether those moments occurred the previous year or the one before. Memory no longer arranges itself according to calendars alone. It organizes itself around seasons, letters, illnesses, friendships, and the slow accumulation of ordinary days. The camp develops its own methods of measuring the passage of time. Some prisoners quietly mark the passing weeks with small scratches hidden beneath a bunk or inside the cover of a notebook permitted by the authorities. Others abandon counting altogether after discovering that numbers alone can become burdensome when release remains uncertain. Instead, they notice subtler changes. A young sapling beyond the fence grows tall enough to rise above the lower strands of wire. Roofs darken beneath another winter of smoke. Boots repaired countless times finally require patches upon patches until almost none of the original leather remains visible. These transformations occur so gradually that they can only be recognized by those who have remained long enough to witness them. You watch an elderly prisoner pause outside the barracks as evening light settles gently across the compound. He turns toward the western sky, where clouds have begun reflecting the soft gold of the setting sun. For several moments he says nothing at all. There is no obvious reason for stopping, no conversation waiting nearby, no task requiring attention. Perhaps the color of the sky reminds him of fields beyond his home, or perhaps it simply offers a quiet beauty that belongs to no nation and cannot be enclosed by fences. Such moments are rarely dramatic. They pass almost unnoticed except by those who understand how valuable they have become. Hope, too, acquires a quieter form with the passing years. It no longer depends entirely upon dramatic announcements or rumors carried from distant fronts. Instead, it settles into habits that gently acknowledge tomorrow without demanding certainty from it. A prisoner plants seeds in a small garden because vegetables will be needed months from now. Another carefully preserves scraps of cloth for repairs not yet required. Someone begins teaching a younger companion mathematics or a foreign language with lessons expected to continue throughout the coming winter. These choices reveal a remarkable confidence. They assume that life, however restricted, will continue. Religious faith often deepens in similarly practical ways. Services held inside the camp vary greatly according to circumstances, available clergy, and official regulations. Yet prayer frequently becomes woven into everyday routine rather than reserved for moments of crisis alone. Men who rarely attended church before the war sometimes discover comfort simply in hearing familiar words spoken aloud. Others find quiet meaning in private reflection while walking to labor details or standing patiently during evening roll call. Faith does not erase uncertainty. It offers a language through which uncertainty can be carried with greater steadiness. Not everyone finds comfort so easily. There are days when discouragement settles across the barracks with almost physical weight. News fails to arrive. A companion becomes seriously ill. Harsh weather shortens tempers already worn thin by repetition. Rumors of imminent liberation dissolve once more beneath ordinary routine. During such periods, silence grows more common than conversation. Even familiar jokes lose some of their warmth. The institution continues functioning with mechanical consistency, yet inside the minds of those living within it, another struggle quietly unfolds. You notice how rarely that struggle is carried alone for long. Someone invites the quiet man to help repair a table in the workshop. Another saves him a place beside the stove during the evening meal without drawing attention to the gesture. A letter received from home is read aloud because its ordinary details, children returning to school, orchards beginning to blossom, neighbors repairing storm-damaged roofs, momentarily belong to everyone listening. Shared memory becomes a form of shared strength. The camp's invisible society, built patiently over months and years, reveals its greatest purpose during these quieter moments when hope requires gentle reinforcement rather than dramatic encouragement. Outside the fences, the war continues, changing in ways only partly understood by those inside. Front lines advance and retreat. Governments issue declarations. Factories produce weapons in astonishing numbers. Entire cities experience destruction, occupation, liberation, and rebuilding while the prisoners continue following the same path between their barracks and the kitchens. It would be easy to imagine that they have become detached from history itself. Yet this impression is misleading. They remain deeply connected to the war, not through movement across battlefields, but through its consequences. Every delayed letter, every reduction in food supplies, every newly arrived transport of prisoners reflects decisions made far beyond the horizon. As darkness settles across the compound, the final whistle of the day echoes between the barracks before gradually fading into the evening air. Lamps are extinguished one by one until only the faint glow from dying stove embers remains. Around you, breathing slowly fills the room with a rhythm more constant than clocks. Tomorrow will almost certainly resemble today in its outward appearance. The same whistle will sound. The same paths will be walked. The same fences will cast their long morning shadows across the earth. Yet within those repeated hours, countless quiet acts of endurance will continue unfolding, each one preserving a measure of humanity against the immense pressure of waiting. It is an endurance that asks for no audience and leaves behind few monuments, but without it, survival itself would have become far more difficult than any barbed wire could ever make it. Work, duty, and small choices. When the morning whistle sounds, not every prisoner walks toward the same destination. Some remain within the camp to repair roofs, clean kitchens, tend vegetable plots, or assist in workshops whose quiet industry helps sustain daily life behind the wire. Others assemble near the gates, waiting for labor detachments that will carry them beyond the perimeter under armed escort. The distinction varies according to nationality, military rank, international agreements, local conditions, and the policies of those administering the camp. Yet for many prisoners, labor gradually becomes one of the defining experiences of captivity, not because the work itself is always extraordinary, but because it reshapes the relationship between time, purpose, and survival. The regulations established by the international conventions governing prisoners of war attempted to define what kinds of labor could be required. Officers were generally exempt from compulsory manual work, while enlisted personnel might be assigned to agriculture, forestry, industry, construction, maintenance, or transportation, provided the work complied with the laws then recognized between nations. Reality, however, seldom followed written principles with complete consistency. Conditions varied enormously from one country to another, from one commandant to the next, and from one stage of the war to another. For some, work offered relief from the monotony of confinement. For others, it became another burden added to an already difficult existence. You watch a labor detachment gather outside the main gate before sunrise. Their clothing bears the careful repairs accumulated over many months. Gloves rarely match. Scarves have been knitted from unraveled thread. Boots reveal fresh stitching beside leather worn smooth by long use. No one speaks very loudly. The routine has become familiar enough that unnecessary conversation can wait until the road begins stretching away from the camp. The gate opens with quiet mechanical certainty. Guards count the men as they pass through, comparing faces with lists prepared the previous evening. Beyond the fence, the landscape immediately feels different, though freedom remains as distant as before. Fields widen toward the horizon. Forest paths disappear beneath tall pines. Farmhouses stand where smoke rises from breakfast fires already burning before dawn. The prisoners move through a living countryside, yet always within carefully defined limits. They work outside the camp, but they do not leave captivity behind. Agricultural labor occupies many prisoners across Europe. During harvest seasons, groups move through wheat fields whose golden rows sway gently beneath late summer winds. Others gather potatoes from dark autumn soil, stack hay before approaching storms, repair fences damaged by weather, or help drain flooded ground after heavy rain. Much of this work had once been performed by local men now serving in armies far from home. War created labor shortages that reached deep into the countryside, and prisoners often became part of an uneasy agricultural rhythm connecting battlefields to ordinary farms. The work itself carries a quiet familiarity for many. A farmer captured while defending his country already understands how to judge healthy soil by its texture or recognize approaching rain from the movement of distant clouds. A carpenter instinctively selects the straightest timber before beginning repairs. A mechanic listens to an engine with the same attentive patience he once used in civilian workshops. Military uniforms have not erased years of practical knowledge acquired long before enlistment. In unexpected ways, captivity returns people to occupations they believed the war had interrupted forever. You notice how carefully some prisoners observe the ordinary life unfolding around them during these labor details. Children cycle along country roads carrying schoolbooks beneath their arms. Church bells drift across valleys on quiet Sunday mornings. Cows move patiently between pastures while shepherd dogs guide them with practiced ease. Laundry hangs outside cottages where families continue arranging their days according to routines older than the conflict itself. These glimpses are often brief, lasting only moments before work resumes, yet they possess remarkable emotional weight. They remind the prisoners that beyond the fences and guard towers, ordinary life has not disappeared. It has continued, changing with the seasons while they remained within the measured routine of captivity. Relationships with civilians vary greatly depending upon place and circumstance. Some farmers exchange only the minimum words necessary to complete the day's work, uncertain how much conversation regulations permit or prudence encourages. Others quietly offer practical kindnesses that remain almost invisible to outside observers. An extra ladle of water during a hot afternoon. A few minutes rest beneath a tree after particularly exhausting labor. The chance to warm cold hands beside a barn stove during winter before returning to the fields. Such gestures are seldom dramatic. They exist within narrow boundaries shaped by fear, regulations, and the risks faced by everyone involved. Back inside the camp, those assigned to internal duties experience another rhythm altogether. Workshops echo steadily with saws, hammers, and files shaping timber, repairing furniture, or maintaining equipment essential to daily life. Kitchens prepare meals whose ingredients reflect both scarcity and remarkable ingenuity. Medical orderlies move quietly between patients, changing dressings with supplies stretched far beyond their intended use. Tailors patiently reinforce clothing that has already survived countless repairs. Every task, however modest, contributes to the functioning of a community that has learned to preserve itself through continuous effort. By the end of the afternoon, labor has become more than a requirement imposed by authority. For many prisoners, it offers something unexpectedly valuable. The hours pass with clearer purpose. Muscles grow tired for understandable reasons. Conversation arises naturally between shared tasks. A repaired roof no longer leaks. Firewood stacked today will warm the barracks tomorrow. Potatoes harvested before frost will become winter meals. None of these accomplishments shortens captivity, yet each quietly reminds those performing them that even within severe limitations, human effort can still leave the world slightly better than it was at sunrise. As the weeks pass, the work itself becomes less remarkable than the decisions surrounding it. A prisoner cannot usually choose whether labor is required, but he often discovers that countless smaller choices remain quietly within his reach. He may decide to sharpen a tool properly rather than hurriedly. He may straighten a stack of timber before leaving the workshop, even when no one has asked him to do so. He may help a companion struggling with a heavy load or quietly take the more difficult portion of a shared task because another man's injured shoulder has not fully healed. These decisions rarely appear in official records, yet they gradually shape the moral landscape of captivity. The camp authorities, like the prisoners themselves, begin recognizing individual skills. A mechanic who consistently repairs damaged machinery may remain assigned to the same workshop for months. A trained electrician becomes responsible for maintaining limited lighting within certain buildings. Men who speak multiple languages occasionally assist with translation between guards and newly arrived prisoners whose instructions might otherwise be misunderstood. None of these roles restores freedom, but they create small islands of responsibility inside an environment largely defined by obedience. You watch a group repairing the roof of one of the older barracks after several days of steady rain. The work proceeds slowly because materials are scarce and every usable board must be measured carefully before being cut. One prisoner steadies a ladder while another passes up tools wrapped in cloth to prevent them slipping from cold hands. There is little conversation beyond practical instructions, yet the rhythm of cooperation feels almost instinctive. Water dripping through the roof would inconvenience everyone sleeping below, regardless of nationality or rank. A repaired roof belongs to the entire community. Weather continues shaping every aspect of labor. Summer heat turns fields into shimmering expanses where dust clings to boots and clothing before settling into every fold of fabric. Autumn rains transform roads into heavy mud that clings stubbornly to wagon wheels and tired feet alike. Winter hardens the earth until each strike of a shovel sends vibrations through frozen hands, while spring asks workers to begin again as thawed ground reveals fences needing repair, paths requiring attention, and buildings damaged by months of snow and ice. Nature imposes its own schedule upon captivity, indifferent to military regulations or administrative plans. The physical demands of labor also reveal the remarkable ingenuity with which prisoners conserve strength. Experienced men rarely hurry unless circumstances truly require it. They learn to lift together rather than alone, to pace themselves across long days, and to preserve energy for the walk back to camp after work has ended. Such habits are not signs of reluctance. They are practical adaptations developed through prolonged experience. Every unnecessary effort today may become tomorrow's exhaustion, and tomorrow will almost certainly bring another day's work. You begin noticing how knowledge passes almost silently between generations of prisoners. A man newly assigned to forestry watches an older companion demonstrate how to fell a tree safely despite worn equipment. Another learns to repair cracked boot leather using scraps of cloth soaked in grease before stitching them into place. In the gardens inside the camp, experienced growers quietly explain which vegetables survive poor soil most reliably and how kitchen scraps can enrich exhausted ground over time. These lessons are rarely formal. They emerge naturally while hands remain occupied, allowing practical wisdom to travel almost unnoticed from one person to another. Not every labor assignment offers moments of quiet satisfaction. Some are repetitive beyond measure, demanding the same motion hour after hour until the body continues almost without conscious thought. Others expose prisoners to harsh weather or dangerous machinery maintained under increasingly difficult wartime conditions. Fatigue accumulates slowly, revealing itself not through dramatic collapse but through aching joints, slower movements, and evenings when conversation fades earlier than usual because everyone is simply too tired to continue speaking. Endurance is rarely heroic in appearance. More often, it resembles ordinary persistence carried forward one day at a time. Occasionally, labor brings prisoners into brief contact with evidence of the wider conflict. Railway lines carry military freight toward distant fronts. Columns of civilian refugees pass quietly along country roads with carts carrying the remains of interrupted lives. Aircraft appear high overhead, their distant engines briefly interrupting the ordinary sounds of saws, hammers, or harvesting before fading once more beyond the horizon. Such moments remind everyone that the camp does not exist outside the war. It exists within it, connected by supply lines, transportation networks, weather, and decisions made far beyond the view of those working below. By late afternoon, the return journey toward the camp acquires a rhythm all its own. Boots strike familiar roads with measured steadiness. Conversation, when it comes, is softer than it had been in the morning. Shoulders carry the pleasant heaviness that follows honest physical effort alongside the deeper weariness of prolonged captivity. As the fences gradually reappear in the distance, no one mistakes them for home. Yet neither are they entirely foreign anymore. They have become the place where companions wait, where evening meals are shared, where letters may arrive, and where another ordinary day will quietly become part of memory. When the gate closes behind the returning labor detachments, the sound is as familiar as the whistle that began the morning. It marks not simply the end of work, but the completion of another cycle within the larger rhythm of captivity. The repaired roof, the harvested field, the stacked firewood, the mended tools, and the shared burdens will all remain when darkness falls. They cannot unlock the gates or shorten the war, but they leave behind quiet evidence that purpose can survive even where freedom does not. It is through such modest accomplishments, repeated patiently across months and years, that many prisoners discover another way to resist the slow erosion of hope. Illness, care, and quiet compassion. Every camp possesses an infirmary, though no two are quite alike. Some occupy purpose-built buildings separated from the barracks by narrow paths of packed earth. Others consist of little more than a few rooms set aside within existing structures, where beds stand close together beneath windows that admit as much fresh air as the season allows. Their appearance reflects the same realities that shape the rest of captivity. Resources depend upon supply lines, local administration, relief organizations, weather, and the changing fortunes of war itself. Yet regardless of their size or equipment, these places share a common purpose. They exist where ordinary endurance briefly gives way to deliberate care. Illness rarely announces itself dramatically. More often, it begins quietly. A persistent cough continues after morning roll call. A sore foot refuses to heal despite careful cleaning each evening. Fatigue lingers longer than expected after labor. A fever settles gradually across the body until familiar routines become unexpectedly difficult to complete. In the close quarters of camp life, such changes seldom remain private for long. Men sleeping only a few feet apart notice restless nights, reduced appetites, or the slower movements of companions who had once carried themselves with greater ease. You watch an orderly move carefully between the beds of the infirmary during the early hours before the rest of the camp has fully awakened. The room remains hushed except for the occasional creak of floorboards and the quiet clink of enamel mugs placed beside each patient. Morning light filters through thin curtains, revealing shelves lined with neatly folded bandages, carefully labeled bottles, and medical instruments maintained with remarkable attention despite years of constant use. Nothing appears abundant. Everything appears valued. Doctors captured alongside the soldiers they once served frequently continue practicing medicine throughout captivity. Surgeons become camp physicians. Military nurses, where present, continue caring for the sick under entirely different circumstances than those they had known near the front. Medical orderlies improvise solutions with supplies stretched far beyond their intended purpose. Professional knowledge remains intact even when equipment does not. Experience often becomes the most valuable resource available. The challenges facing these medical staff are rarely confined to dramatic injuries. Wounds sustained during capture gradually heal or become chronic concerns requiring steady attention. More common are the ordinary illnesses that accompany crowded living conditions. Respiratory infections spread easily through barracks warmed unevenly during winter. Minor cuts become troublesome when nutrition is poor or clean dressings are scarce. Digestive illnesses appear when water supplies become unreliable or food quality declines. Every patient represents not only an individual needing treatment but also another reminder that the health of one prisoner is closely connected to the well-being of everyone sharing the same environment. You notice how often prevention becomes as important as treatment. Floors are scrubbed with patient regularity despite limited cleaning materials. Blankets are aired whenever weather permits. Windows are opened briefly even during cold months to reduce stale air inside crowded rooms. Water is boiled whenever possible. Small habits repeated faithfully each day accomplish what scarce medicine sometimes cannot. The routines of hygiene become another quiet form of collective responsibility. The infirmary also alters the pace of time. Elsewhere in the camp, whistles, labor details, meal schedules, and roll calls divide the day into familiar intervals. Here, attention shifts towards slower rhythms. Temperatures are checked. Dressings changed. Medicines measured carefully so that none are wasted. Patients drift between sleep and wakefulness while footsteps remain deliberately soft. Conversation, when it occurs, is subdued not because silence is required, but because recovery itself asks for calm. Outside the windows, ordinary camp life continues almost unchanged. Labor detachments assemble. Smoke rises from the kitchens. Hammers echo from workshops. Guards follow their familiar patrol routes between the watchtowers. Those inside the infirmary hear these sounds clearly enough to know the camp has begun another ordinary day, yet they experience it from a different distance. For a brief time, they are observers rather than participants, measuring the passing hours not through work completed but through small improvements, a reduced fever, steadier breathing, an appetite slowly returning after days of absence. Acts of kindness become particularly visible in these rooms. A prisoner returning from the kitchens quietly brings warm water for someone unable to walk comfortably. Another reads aloud from a borrowed book because his companion's eyes have grown too tired to follow the page. A carefully saved piece of bread is placed beside a bedside mug without explanation. None of these gestures changes the scarcity surrounding them. Yet together they create an atmosphere in which illness is not faced in isolation. As afternoon light softens across the infirmary floor, you begin to understand that compassion inside captivity rarely announces itself with dramatic sacrifice. More often, it appears through consistency. A blanket adjusted before the evening grows cold. A reassuring word spoken while changing a bandage. A chair pulled closer so that no patient need endure a difficult night entirely alone. These quiet routines, repeated day after day, become another thread holding together the invisible society that has slowly grown within the camp. Recovery inside a prisoner of war camp is rarely measured in dramatic turning points. More often, it is recognized through ordinary improvements so gradual they might escape notice elsewhere. A man who yesterday required assistance to stand now reaches the doorway without support. Another finishes an entire bowl of soup after several days of eating only a few careful spoonfuls. Someone who had remained silent through fever quietly joins a conversation drifting across the room. These modest changes become reasons for quiet satisfaction because they represent something larger than physical healing alone. They suggest that life, despite everything surrounding it, continues moving gently forward. The infirmary also becomes a place where different generations of captivity briefly meet. Newly arrived prisoners often pass through after exhausting journeys or untreated wounds sustained during capture. Beside them rest men who have lived behind the wire for years, their illnesses shaped less by battle than by the slow accumulation of difficult seasons, demanding labor, and the ordinary where carried by prolonged confinement. Their conversations reveal different relationships with time. One still measures days from the moment of capture. Another has long since begun measuring them by winters survived, harvests witnessed beyond the fences, or companions remembered. You watch an experienced camp physician pause beside a window before beginning his afternoon rounds. Beyond the glass, a labor detachment is returning from the fields, their figures moving steadily along the familiar road leading back toward the main gate. He remains still for a moment, observing them without interruption, before quietly turning once more toward the beds behind him. Years of practice have taught him that medicine inside captivity extends beyond prescriptions or dressings. Sometimes the most valuable treatment is simply the confidence that someone will continue appearing beside the bed each morning and evening, regardless of whether supplies improve or conditions worsen. Scarcity demands remarkable ingenuity. Bandages are washed, dried, and reused whenever doing so remains safe. Splints are fashioned from carefully smoothed scraps of timber. Walking sticks emerge from branches shaped patiently with pocket knives retained for practical purposes. Bottles are cleaned and refilled. Containers serve new purposes once their original contents have been exhausted. Nothing useful is discarded lightly because replacing even the simplest object may prove impossible for months. Resourcefulness becomes as essential to healing as medical knowledge itself. Nutrition presents another quiet challenge. Recovery depends upon strength that illness has already diminished, yet food inside the camp is often carefully rationed. When parcels from relief organizations arrive, those caring for the sick sometimes manage to reserve small portions for patients whose condition requires additional nourishment. A little condensed milk stirred into hot water. A few extra potatoes shared after the evening meal. Preserved meat divided into careful portions rather than consumed all at once. Such additions appear modest when viewed from outside the camp, but to someone slowly regaining health they can carry enormous practical importance. You begin noticing that the infirmary also serves another purpose rarely described in official reports. It offers a temporary refuge from the relentless rhythm of labor and roll calls without removing anyone entirely from the life of the camp. Patients continue hearing familiar voices drifting in from outside, the steady clatter of buckets at the water pump, the measured footsteps of guards changing shifts, and the distant ring of hammers from the workshops. The world has not stopped simply because illness has interrupted one person's routine. Recovery, therefore, becomes not a return to an unfamiliar place, but a gradual rejoining of a community that has continued patiently in one's absence. Death, when it comes, is approached with remarkable restraint. Camps differed greatly in mortality according to location, conditions, disease, and the policies of those administering them. Some prisoners survived years of confinement before returning home. Others did not. Within the barracks and infirmaries, companions learned to speak of those who had died not through dramatic declarations, but through quiet remembrance. A bunk carefully emptied. Personal belongings gathered respectfully together. Familiar routines continuing the following morning because life, however reluctantly, always demanded continuation. Grief found little room for ceremony, yet it remained deeply present in the ordinary spaces left behind. The surviving prisoners often became careful guardians of one another's memories. They remembered hometowns mentioned during evening conversations, the names of wives, parents, or children described in letters, favorite songs softly hummed while repairing boots, or stories repeated about farms, fishing boats, workshops, classrooms, and city streets that now felt unimaginably distant. In this way, the camp's invisible society preserved not only living people, but also those who were no longer there to tell their own stories. Memory itself became another quiet form of care. As evening settles once more across the compound, the infirmary gradually grows quieter. Lamps cast gentle pools of light upon clean bandages folded for tomorrow's use. The stove radiates a slow warmth that softens the chill gathering beyond the windows. Outside, another roll call concludes, another meal is served, and another ordinary day draws peacefully toward its end. Inside, a nurse adjusts a blanket over sleeping shoulders while an orderly records the day's observations with careful handwriting that leaves little room for unnecessary words. You watch these final movements unfold with almost ceremonial calm. There are no victories to announce, no dramatic recoveries demanding celebration. Instead, there is something quieter and perhaps more enduring. Within an institution built to regulate bodies through fences, schedules, and authority, people have continued caring for one another with patience that no regulation could fully command. Compassion has become part of the camp's daily routine, as ordinary as morning whistles or evening lamps. It asks for little recognition, leaves behind few monuments, and yet without it, countless prisoners would have found the long years of captivity immeasurably harder to endure. When the war begins to move again. There comes a point in every long captivity when the outside world begins making itself felt in ways that cannot be ignored. Not through dramatic announcements or sudden liberation, but through subtle changes that ripple quietly across the routines of the camp. A train passes more frequently along the nearby railway. Aircraft become a familiar sound overhead rather than an occasional interruption. New prisoners arrive carrying stories from fronts that did not exist when the older inmates were first captured. Supplies fluctuate unexpectedly. The institution, once seemingly fixed outside history, begins revealing that it has always been connected to events far beyond its fences. For those who have spent years inside the camp, these changes are almost unsettling. Routine has become so dependable that even small disruptions attract careful attention. The kitchen receives fewer deliveries than usual. Guard shifts are altered without explanation. Maintenance projects are postponed because timber or tools are suddenly needed elsewhere. None of these developments explains itself, yet together they suggest movement beyond the horizon. The war, which for so long had seemed distant despite shaping every aspect of captivity, is once again approaching. You watch a group of prisoners pause during an afternoon labor detail as the distant sound of aircraft gradually fills the sky. They do not stop working entirely. Years of experience have taught them that curiosity rarely excuses unfinished tasks. Yet almost every head turns briefly upward. High above, tiny silver shapes pass beyond scattered clouds, leaving faint trails that slowly dissolve into the blue. No one can identify them with certainty. They disappear too quickly, and the distance is too great. Even so, conversations continue long after the engines have faded, each man quietly fitting the brief sight into whatever understanding of the war he still possesses. New arrivals now bring different kinds of stories than those heard months or years earlier. Instead of describing the campaigns that led to their own capture, they speak about changing front lines, cities recently liberated or newly occupied, armies advancing where retreat once seemed inevitable, and roads crowded with refugees moving in every direction. Their uniforms are often more worn than those of prisoners already settled into camp life, carrying fresh evidence of the conflict's latest phase. Mud from unfamiliar regions clings to boots. Equipment bears marks of hurried campaigns fought under conditions unlike those remembered by men captured long before. The established prisoners listen carefully, though experience has made them cautious. They have learned that accurate information rarely arrives complete. Every account reflects only one corner of an immense conflict unfolding across continents. One soldier witnessed a bridge destroyed during retreat. Another remembers columns of tanks moving steadily westward. A pilot describes cities seen from thousands of meters above the earth. None of them can fully explain the larger picture. Together, however, their stories begin suggesting that the balance of the war is slowly changing. You notice that hope responds carefully to these developments. Earlier in captivity, rumors often spread quickly before dissolving into disappointment. Now the conversations carry a quieter restraint. Men discuss possibilities rather than certainties. They compare details from letters, newspapers, and new arrivals without rushing toward conclusions. Experience has taught them that the distance between encouraging news and personal freedom can remain unexpectedly long. They welcome signs of change while continuing to mend clothing, repair roofs, prepare gardens, and follow the ordinary routines that tomorrow will almost certainly require. The guards themselves seem subtly altered. Their movements remain disciplined, yet conversations among them appear more frequent than before. Notices are posted, replaced, then posted again with unusual regularity. Supply vehicles arrive at irregular hours. Officers visit administrative buildings more often, sometimes remaining inside for long meetings whose contents remain unknown beyond closed doors. None of these observations proves anything independently, but together they create an atmosphere in which even ordinary routines begin carrying unfamiliar tension. Seasonal change reinforces this quiet uncertainty. Spring returns beyond the fences much as it always has. Trees produce fresh leaves. Birds nest beneath the eaves of storage sheds. Rain softens the ground until new grass gradually appears along places worn bare during winter. Nature continues following its own patient calendar, indifferent to military campaigns. Yet this spring feels somehow different to those who have survived several others within the same enclosure. They recognize familiar blossoms and familiar birdsong, but now they also notice more trains upon the railway, more aircraft crossing the sky, and more strangers entering through the gates carrying news from a world that appears increasingly restless. Inside the barracks that evening, conversation lingers longer than usual after the lamps have been lit. Maps drawn from memory are sketched quietly upon scraps of paper. Rivers, mountains, and cities are debated by men whose understanding comes from fragments rather than certainty. Someone recalls hearing artillery far in the distance during the previous night. Another wonders whether it might have been a thunderstorm instead. The uncertainty remains unresolved, yet it no longer feels entirely static. Something beyond the fences has begun shifting, and even within the carefully ordered life of the camp, that movement can now be felt like the first distant vibration before an approaching train becomes visible. The prisoners retire to their bunks much as they have every night before. Blankets are folded back. Boots are placed neatly beneath wooden frames. The stove settles into its familiar evening glow. Outwardly, nothing has changed. Yet beneath the quiet routine, Expectation has returned in a new form, not the impatient hope of newly captured soldiers, but the cautious attention of people who have learned that history often announces its arrival through the smallest disturbances long before it reaches the gate itself. The first unmistakable changes do not occur inside the barracks. They appear at the edges of camp life, where ordinary routine meets the larger machinery of war. Railway sidings that had remained quiet for months suddenly receive trains at unusual hours. Convoys pass more frequently along distant roads, sometimes moving toward the front, sometimes away from it. The guards continue performing their duties with practiced discipline, yet the confidence of repetition is gradually replaced by the attentiveness of people adapting to circumstances they themselves cannot fully control. For prisoners who have spent years observing small details, these changes are impossible to overlook. Captivity has trained them to notice patterns that might escape a casual visitor. They recognize when deliveries arrive a day later than expected, when a familiar officer is absent from morning inspection, or when repair work on administrative buildings is quietly abandoned without explanation. Such observations are discussed cautiously, not because certainty has finally arrived, but because uncertainty has begun changing its shape. You watch the morning roll call unfold beneath a pale sky streaked with high clouds. The count proceeds exactly as before, yet beyond the perimeter the distant sound of engines carries across the countryside more often than anyone remembers. Occasionally the guards pause for the briefest moment, glancing toward the horizon before continuing their work. The prisoners notice these glances without drawing attention to them. After years inside the camp, they have learned that the smallest gestures often reveal more than formal announcements. News continues, arriving in fragments. A newly transferred prisoner describes entire regions no longer held by the armies that captured him. Another recalls villages where civilians greeted advancing soldiers with cautious relief after years of occupation. A railway worker assigned to a labor detachment speaks quietly of increasing traffic moving away from the front rather than toward it. None of these accounts offers a complete picture, yet together they suggest that the immense machinery of war is no longer moving in quite the same direction. The camp itself begins preparing for possibilities that remain unspoken. Records are checked with unusual care. Administrative offices remain lit late into the evening as clerks update ledgers already worn from years of handling. Supplies are inventoried more frequently. Some labor detachments are reassigned without explanation. Others remain inside the compound despite work that had previously taken them into surrounding farms and forests. The institution continues functioning, but its confidence has become provisional, as though even the routines themselves are waiting for instructions that have not yet arrived. You notice that conversations among the prisoners change once again. For years they had learned to protect themselves from disappointment by treating every rumor gently. Now they begin speaking less about whether the war is changing and more about what change might eventually require of them. Will they be transferred? Will the camp remain where it is? Will relief arrive through advancing armies, negotiated exchanges, or simply the gradual collapse of the system that has held them for so long? These questions possess no immediate answers, yet asking them no longer feels entirely hypothetical. Some men begin quietly preparing for departure despite having no official reason to do so. Personal belongings are gathered together more carefully than before. Letters are arranged in neat bundles. Small keepsakes accumulated over years of captivity, a carved chess piece, a handmade spoon, a notebook filled with careful handwriting, are wrapped securely in cloth. The preparations are practical rather than optimistic. Experience has taught them that sudden movement, whether toward freedom or another camp, often allows little time for organization. Others hesitate to hope at all. They have witnessed too many false expectations to welcome another without caution. One remembers hearing similar rumors the previous year. Another recalls prisoners who packed their belongings only to discover they would remain exactly where they were for many more months. Their restraint is not pessimism. It is a form of emotional economy developed through long experience, preserving strength until certainty finally replaces possibility. Outside the fences, spring continues unfolding with quiet determination. Apple trees blossom in nearby orchards. Rivers swollen by melting snow carry branches downstream toward places the prisoners cannot see. Swallows return to nest beneath the roofs of barns just as they had before the war and just as they will after it. Nature acknowledges neither victory nor defeat. It simply continues, offering a gentle reminder that the world has always been larger than the conflict that temporarily reshaped it. As evening settles over the compound, the familiar sounds remain remarkably unchanged. Tin bowls are washed and stacked. Boots are cleaned of the day's mud. The stove receives its final pieces of fuel before night. Men climb into bunks that have become as familiar as bedrooms once were, though no one mistakes them for home. Around them, the camp still appears exactly as it had the week before. The fences stand firm. The towers remain occupied. The gates are locked. Yet beneath that unchanging surface, something profound has shifted. For the first time in many months, perhaps many years, the prisoners sense that the camp is no longer the fixed center of their world. It has become, instead, a place through which history is beginning to move once again. They cannot yet see where that movement will lead. They know only that the stillness which has defined so much of their captivity is gradually giving way to motion beyond the horizon. And after years spent learning how to live without control, they now face a final uncertainty: how to prepare for freedom before it has actually arrived. The last days of captivity. The final days of captivity rarely announce themselves with certainty. Looking back after the war, many former prisoners could identify the date on which the gates finally opened or the moment they first stepped beyond the perimeter without escort. Living through those same days, however, they possessed no such clarity. History would later describe liberation with precise dates and advancing armies. Inside the camp, it arrived as another sequence of ordinary mornings whose significance remained hidden until they had already passed. The whistle still sounds before dawn. Men still rise from familiar bunks, folding blankets that have grown thin through years of careful use. Boots are laced with the same deliberate movements practiced every morning since arrival. The stove has burned low during the night, leaving the room cool enough that breath briefly hangs in the air before disappearing into the dim light filtering through the windows. At first glance, nothing distinguishes this morning from hundreds that came before it. Yet the atmosphere has become noticeably different. The guards move with greater urgency than usual, though they attempt to preserve the appearance of routine. Administrative offices remain active long before sunrise. Vehicles come and go through the main gate more frequently than the prisoners remember seeing in previous months. Telephone lines carry conversations whose contents remain unknown, but whose frequency suggests decisions are being made somewhere beyond the camp itself. Even those who know nothing of military operations understand instinctively that institutions rarely become busier without reason. You watch the prisoners notice these details without allowing themselves to be carried away by them. Years of disappointment have taught remarkable discipline. No one rushes toward the fences searching for confirmation. No one abandons ordinary duties because extraordinary events might be approaching. Breakfast is still eaten slowly. Water buckets are still carried across the compound. The sick are still visited in the infirmary before the day's work begins. Hope has become mature enough to coexist with routine rather than replacing it. New sounds now reach the camp with increasing regularity. Distant artillery, once too faint to distinguish from summer thunderstorms, becomes unmistakable during quiet evenings. Aircraft pass overhead in greater numbers, their engines lingering long after the formations have disappeared beyond the clouds. Occasionally, the faint vibration of explosions travels through the earth itself, too distant to threaten the camp directly yet close enough to remind everyone that the front is no longer an abstract line upon an imagined map. War has begun returning to those who believed it had left them years earlier. The camp authorities respond according to circumstances that vary greatly across countries and military commands. Some continue maintaining discipline with remarkable consistency until the very end, determined that order should survive regardless of changing military fortunes. Others begin destroying records, relocating prisoners, or preparing hurried evacuations as advancing armies draw nearer. In certain places, negotiations quietly begin between local commanders and representatives of approaching forces. Elsewhere, uncertainty proves greater than preparation. Every camp experiences these final weeks differently, yet all share one common feature. The future has become impossible to postpone. You notice how conversations change once again inside the barracks. They are no longer dominated by speculation about whether the war is changing. Instead, they turn gently toward questions that had remained almost unimaginable during the long years of captivity. What will home look like now? Who might still be waiting? Which cities remain standing? How many children have grown into adults while fathers remained behind the wire? What occupations will still exist when soldiers finally remove uniforms they have worn for so much of their lives? These questions carry remarkable uncertainty because captivity has preserved certain memories while allowing others to age beyond recognition. A prisoner who remembers his daughter as a small child must now imagine meeting a young woman whose voice he has never heard as an adult. Another still pictures parents whose hair has likely turned gray during his absence. Villages described in old letters may have been destroyed, rebuilt, occupied, liberated, or abandoned entirely. Home has remained vivid inside memory precisely because memory has frozen it in time. Reality has continued moving without asking permission. You watch one man carefully unfold a photograph whose edges have softened after years spent inside the lining of his jacket. The image shows a modest house beneath summer trees, a woman standing near the doorway, and two children whose expressions remain permanently fixed by the camera that captured them before the war. He studies the photograph for several quiet moments before returning it to its familiar place. He understands, perhaps better than anyone else, that the house may still stand while the people have changed beyond easy recognition. Or the people may survive while the house itself has disappeared. The photograph has preserved a moment. It cannot preserve time. Evening arrives with its customary gentleness. The lamps are lit. Soup is served. Boots are cleaned. Letters are folded away. The stove glows softly beneath the darkening sky. Everything appears exactly as it has for years. And yet beneath these familiar routines runs a quiet awareness shared by nearly everyone inside the camp. They are no longer waiting simply because tomorrow resembles yesterday. They are waiting because tomorrow may finally become something different. Not certainly. Not yet. But perhaps for the first time since the gates closed behind them, the future has begun moving toward them instead of endlessly remaining beyond the wire. The morning arrives with an unfamiliar quiet. Not the quiet of winter snow settling over the barracks, nor the quiet that follows evening roll call when tired voices gradually disappear beneath blankets and darkness. This silence feels different because something expected has failed to happen. A whistle does not sound at its usual hour. The footsteps that normally pass beneath the windows arrive later than anyone anticipated. Somewhere beyond the walls, a gate opens and closes, but the familiar rhythm of commands and responses has become uncertain, interrupted by pauses that seem to stretch longer than they should. No one moves immediately. Years of routine have taught caution. The absence of an order is not, by itself, permission to act. Men remain seated upon their bunks, exchanging brief glances rather than hurried words. Someone quietly folds a blanket already folded the evening before. Another adjusts the strap on a worn boot despite having nowhere obvious to walk. They wait because waiting has become the safest response to uncertainty. You watch daylight gradually fill the barracks as though the room itself is holding its breath. Outside, the compound looks remarkably ordinary. Smoke still rises from the kitchen chimney. The watchtowers remain standing against the pale morning sky. The fences cast familiar shadows across the damp earth. It is tempting to believe that nothing has changed at all. Then another sound emerges. Not commands. Not whistles. Voices. They are distant at first, carried unevenly across the camp by a breeze moving through newly leafed trees beyond the perimeter. More voices follow, accompanied by engines unlike those the prisoners have grown accustomed to hearing. The guards move quickly, though not with the measured confidence that has defined their routines for so many years. Some disappear toward the administrative buildings. Others gather near the main gate, speaking in hurried conversations that remain impossible to understand from this distance. No announcement follows immediately. History seldom arrives with perfect timing. Instead, uncertainty lingers for hours that seem longer than entire seasons. The prisoners continue waiting inside the familiar boundaries of the camp while events unfold just beyond sight. Somewhere outside, negotiations may be taking place. Somewhere else, military units may already be entering nearby towns. Roads that once carried labor detachments now carry armies moving in directions opposite those remembered during earlier years of the war. At last, movement begins spreading through the compound. The barrack doors open. Prisoners step outside cautiously, not rushing toward the fences but gathering quietly in the open spaces between the buildings. Faces search one another as much as the horizon, each person hoping someone else understands what is happening more clearly than they do. Yet certainty remains surprisingly elusive. Then the gate opens. Not for a labor detail. Not for another transport. Simply opens. You watch the moment carefully because it contains almost none of the drama later generations might expect. There are no triumphant speeches echoing across the compound. No sudden transformation washes away years of captivity in an instant. Many prisoners remain standing exactly where they are, almost reluctant to believe that the boundary governing their lives has ceased functioning in the way it always had before. Some smile quietly. Others remove their caps without realizing they have done so. A few weep openly. Many simply stand in silence. Freedom, after years of imagining it, arrives not as an overwhelming emotion but as an unfamiliar absence. The routines that shaped every hour of the day have dissolved almost without warning. For so long, every decision belonged to someone else. Now the smallest choices suddenly return. Which direction should one walk? What should be carried? What should be left behind? Even these simple questions feel unexpectedly difficult after years spent inside an institution where almost every movement had been prescribed. The camp itself changes almost immediately. The fences remain standing, yet they no longer possess the same meaning. Watchtowers continue overlooking the compound, but observation has lost its authority. Barracks still shelter those who slept within them the previous night, though many doors now remain open to the spring air for the first time without concern. The buildings have not changed. Their purpose has. You notice that few prisoners hurry to leave. Some return to their bunks one final time, carefully collecting photographs, notebooks, carved chess pieces, handmade spoons, repaired jackets, and bundles of letters tied together with fading string. Others seek out companions from whom they wish to say goodbye before uncertain journeys begin. Doctors visit the infirmary to ensure the weakest patients will not be forgotten in the confusion. Men who shared years within the same barracks shake hands quietly, embracing without ceremony because words seem inadequate for experiences they have endured together. Outside the camp, the roads stretch toward countries transformed by war. Homes wait, or perhaps no longer exist. Families hope, or perhaps have already mourned. Entire lives must now be rediscovered. Yet for a little while longer, many remain inside the familiar enclosure, standing between two worlds. Behind them lies captivity, measured by whistles, roll calls, patched blankets, and endless waiting. Ahead lies freedom, uncertain and unfinished, carrying questions no less profound than those they leave behind. You watch them step through the open gate one by one. Not as soldiers marching toward battle. Not as prisoners under escort. Simply as people walking carefully into lives that have continued without them. The camp grows quieter with each departure. The wind moves gently through the empty spaces between the barracks. Smoke still drifts upward from the chimneys. Somewhere above, swallows circle beneath the spring sky exactly as they did before the first prisoner ever arrived. The institution that once seemed permanent has become part of history. What remains are the people who carried their humanity through it. The fences are quiet now. In many places, they no longer stand at all. Timber has long since returned to the earth, barbed wire has rusted beneath fields reclaimed by grass, and watchtowers that once measured every movement have disappeared into photographs, museum collections, or memory. Travelers pass through these landscapes today without always realizing what once occupied the ground beneath their feet. Birds continue crossing the same skies. Rivers continue following the same courses. Seasons arrive with the same patient certainty that accompanied every spring, every autumn, and every winter during the years of captivity. If you visit one of these former camps, the silence can feel surprisingly ordinary. Wind moves through trees planted long after the war ended. Gravel paths lead visitors where prisoners once stood for morning roll call. A restored barrack preserves the dimensions of a room that once held dozens of lives, while empty foundations mark buildings that have vanished altogether. History often survives not through noise, but through absence. The spaces left behind invite reflection precisely because they no longer command attention. You think back to the routines that shaped so much of this journey. The whistle before dawn. Boots placed carefully beneath wooden bunks. Thin soup shared without complaint. Letters unfolded until their creases nearly disappeared. Roofs repaired before another storm arrived. Blankets adjusted over sleeping companions. None of these moments altered the course of the war. Yet together they reveal something quietly remarkable. Human dignity rarely depends upon dramatic acts alone. More often, it is preserved through ordinary habits practiced faithfully when no audience is watching. The people who lived inside those camps return to lives forever changed by experiences that were often difficult to describe. Some spoke openly about captivity. Others rarely mentioned it again, carrying the memories privately while rebuilding families, farms, workshops, businesses, and neighborhoods that had also been transformed by war. Many discovered that freedom itself required adjustment. After years in which every hour had been governed by external authority, making simple choices again could feel unexpectedly unfamiliar. The gate had opened, but the habits of captivity faded only gradually. Even so, countless former prisoners carried something home that had survived the wire. They had learned the value of companionship offered without expectation of reward. They had seen how knowledge, kindness, humor, faith, and shared work could persist under extraordinary pressure. They had discovered that hope need not always appear as certainty. Sometimes it survives most faithfully as quiet persistence, the decision to rise once more, repair one more roof, write one more letter, or care for one more companion despite not knowing what tomorrow would bring. The landscapes where those camps once stood have changed beyond recognition, yet the questions they leave behind remain gently relevant. What gives a person dignity when choice becomes scarce? How does routine shape the human spirit? Which small acts become most important when larger freedoms disappear? These are not questions belonging only to history. They belong to every generation that pauses long enough to listen carefully to the lives of those who came before. Perhaps that is why these places continue speaking through their silence. They remind us that endurance is rarely loud. It does not always announce itself through celebrated victories or famous names. More often, it lives in patient repetition, in shared meals, repaired clothing, careful handwriting, familiar songs remembered after the lights have gone out, and friendships formed because people refuse to let one another disappear into loneliness. As evening settles over the old campgrounds, the light softens across fields where fences once divided freedom from captivity. Swallows continue tracing gentle circles through the air. The wind moves through tall grass with the same quiet rhythm that once stirred the edges of military uniforms hanging outside weathered barracks. Nature remembers nothing, and yet it preserves everything, carrying the landscape steadily forward while inviting those who visit to remember for themselves. The prisoners whose footsteps once wore paths through those compounds are gone now. Their voices have faded into letters, diaries, photographs, and the memories preserved by families who carried their stories across generations. Yet each time we slow down long enough to consider their ordinary days, the waiting, the work, the friendships, the quiet acts of compassion, we allow those lives to continue speaking with gentle clarity across the years. And perhaps that is the truest form of remembrance. Not to imagine only how people suffered, but to remember how they continued living. How they continued caring. How they continued hoping. Even when hope itself had become quiet. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.